So today I'm going to talk about the 5 main psychological perspectives that you'll probably come across if you ever take a psych class or anything like that. So in the field of psychology, there are many theories that attempt to explain the underlying reasons why people think the way they think and why people act the way they act. Psychologists have arranged these theories into 5 main perspectives. So for the most part, these are the 5 main ones that you'll probably hear about. Let me ask you something. How do you think neurons can help us predict behavior or help us understand behavior? What about genetics? How can that help us? What about family history, family medical history, or things like that? This is all relating to the biological perspective. So this perspective looks at the biological basis of behavior, which for the most part is pretty self-explanatory. Biopsychologists look at, your genetic makeup along with biological systems to explain and even predict behavior. For example, some people might be predisposed, according to their genetic history, to mental illnesses. So this is from a biological perspective, even though a lot of times it's more than just biological factors. But this is really what the biological perspective is about. How do cognitions impact behavior? What about emotions? What about something like expectations? How can these things impact behavior? This is what the cognitive perspective looks like. The cognitive perspective really just looks at the mental and cognitive processes. Okay, well, what are mental and cognitive processes? Well, cognition is just basically thoughts. It's just mental action, the process of acquiring, knowledge through, stimuli and other experiences. So mental processes are all just involved in processing knowledge and gaining knowledge through various manners. So this is things like, decision making, memory, emotions, thoughts, things like that. So this is really what the cognitive perspective is all about. What am I talking about here when I mean expectations? So according to the cognitive perspective, expectations can predict future behaviors. Okay, but what do I mean by that? So I'll give you an example. Say you're planning on going to a restaurant later on. You'll probably have some expectations about, whether or not you're going to like the food at the restaurant or whether or not you're just in general going to have a good time at the restaurant. And according to the cognitive perspective, these expectations can influence or predict how you are actually going to behave when you're in that situation. So say, for example, you think you're really going to have a great time at the restaurant. You're really going to like the food, the people you're with, etc. According to a cognitive perspective, they would say that this would influence you to have a more positive experience when you're actually there. The same can be said for negative expectations as well. So your expectations of an upcoming event will actually affect how you feel and act when you're actually at that event. This is all from a cognitive perspective. How can behavior be reinforced? What about punishment? How can we learn how not to do something through punishment? And how does that influence behavior? So this is all related to the behaviorist perspective. And this perspective attempts to answer these questions by looking at the different associations we make between our thoughts and our actions. This relationship is pretty important for this perspective. Behaviorists are concerned with how people learn the associations between stimuli and responses. So according to, a behaviorists may say that, there's no such thing as free will, that they believe that you learn everything through reinforcement or punishment, these learned associations, and that they're everywhere. Whether or not we are really aware of it, we all have these learned associations. What does this mean? What are learned associations? Learned associations are just when, someone creates a relationship between stimuli and external stimuli, whether that's auditory or visual or something like that, and a behavior. This is crucial to this perspective. So let me give you an example. Say you use a perfume for the first time. Then a little later you start to develop a headache. You may learn to have an association between these two things. You may think that the perfume causes the headache, causing you not to use the perfume again. When you get down to the details, it's a lot more complicated. There's things like unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus, but I'm not going to talk about that today. The main point that I want to get across is that the behaviorist perspective is really just about these learned associations, these learned behaviors, and the relationship between, an environmental stimuli and the behavior, and the idea that you can be trained to behave in a certain way. So this is the behaviorist perspective. Can dreams provide a reliable look into our subconscious? How can childhood impact the way we live out the rest of our lives? So the psychodynamic perspective attempts to answer these questions by looking at the unconscious mind and the natural urges we have. You've probably heard of Sigmund Freud, who's considered to be one of the first to promote the psychodynamic perspective, though a lot of his theories have been since discredited. He's still an important figure. The psychodynamic perspective emphasizes the importance of these early childhood experiences on shaping your behavior later on in life. It also looks at the subconscious, something Freud was really interested in. So, psychodynamic perspective in general is just looking at these dynamics of the mind, like motivational factors, defense mechanisms, internal conflicts, and these unconscious mental processes, and sort of bringing them to the light, bringing them to consciousness, if that makes sense. So that is really what the psychodynamic perspective was all about. The humanist perspective. So this is a very interesting psychological perspective because it looks at how individuals can reach their full potential and become the best version of themselves that they can be. From a humanist perspective, there is such a thing as free will. And to become self-actualized in order to reach one's goals, you need to be able to, make choices that lead to those goals and to be really just in control of what you want. And from a humanist perspective, this is all in the control of the person, the client or the person. From a humanist perspective, individual empowerment will help you reach your goal. And this perspective really looks at how, building self-esteem, developing the individual empowerment, becoming more self-actualized, these can all help lead to more positive behaviors or just different behaviors in general, a change in behaviors. So that's really what the humanist perspective is all about. So just to go over what we talked about, the biological perspective looks at how the nervous system, genetics, and other biological factors contribute to behavior. The cognitive perspective looks at how emotions, desires, and mental processes contribute to behavior. The behaviorist perspective looks at how associations made with external stimuli can create learned behavior. The psychodynamic perspective looks at unconscious thoughts and unconscious processes that contribute to behavior. And last, the humanistic perspective looks at how becoming self-aware of our individual potential can contribute to behavior. So these are the 5 main psych perspectives you're bound to come across.